start with lesson 3.5, talking about graphing, square roots, and cube root functions. First thing we want to look at is the basic radical functions. This will make a little more sense later, but for now, for a square root function, we have a times the square root of x minus h plus k. Now, this plus k is outside the radical sign. This is similar to the parent function of the square root, where of course a, h, and k are all going to represent transformations done to the graph. Then of course down here below we have the cubic root function. And the basic parent function of that would be just the cubic root of x, but then we have a, h, and k happening to it, and we'll take a look later at what that means for our graph. Let's take a look at our first example, graphing a square root function. We're going to graph y equals 2 times the square root of x, state the domain and the range, and then we're going to compare that to the parent function. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the parent function, and that would be this one right here, hopefully highlighting well. And that's when, just set up our table. We have the square root of 1, the square root of 2, square root of 3, so on and so forth. So you notice that right here we have some nice points at 1, 1 and at 4, 2. Now when we multiply this by 2, we'll create a new table. So plug in some new x values, take the square root of that, and then multiply by 2 to get the values below, the corresponding y values. Plot them on the graph and then draw your line. So this graph out here is going to be y is equal to 2 times the square root of x. Now comparing this to the parent function, obviously it appears to be going out wider, which we could tell from the a value. So it's going to be twice as big. The domain, though, is still the same. All the values of x are greater than or equal to 0. Again, we're only focusing on the positive square roots. And so, of course, that corresponds that for the range, all the y values are also greater than or equal to 0. Notice nothing goes below into negative y or negative x. It's all in this first quadrant over here. Taking a look at a cube root function, this one's going to be a little bit more difficult to see because the basic parent function right here, the cube root of x, it's a little bit hard to see when we're graphing. So I'm going to try and highlight it for you. It's this one here, where if we were looking at this on a normal graph, if I had a normal graph, it would be doing this and then doing a little twist here. Something similar to that. But because we are looking at such a small interval and we're taking a third of it, it's a little bit harder for us to see that. So the highlighted function is the parent function, and then over here in blue, I'm outlining the new function, the 1/3. Now notice also the y interval has changed. Up here, it's not 1, it's 25 hundredths. So this, at the very top, was where y is equal to 1. Looking at our x values, when I plug this in, I take the cube root of it, and then I multiply that by 1/3. So notice that my values are very, very small. Even up here over at the cube root of 8, we know is 2, but when I take a third of 2, equal to 2/3, or if we put that in decimal form, 0.67. So my y value is still very small because the amplitude has widened it. So we're not going out quite as far yet. It's being spread out more. So when you're practicing graphing your functions, you want to make sure that you are taking a look at what the original graph is and what's happening to the new graph. Now for the domain and range. Well, for the domain, this is all the possible x values. Well, I can have cube roots of negative numbers, those are real numbers, and I can have cube roots of positive numbers. So for the domain, x would be all reals. So any real number, ignore all this over here, any real number I'm going to be able to use for my x value. So of course, then that corresponds that for the range, I could have, for y, it would be all reals also. I'm not limited to anything that would make this imaginary. Alright, so take a look at a couple of problems. So on some graph paper, I want you to graph these 4 functions and then state the domain and range. Okay, get familiar with making those charts and getting those values in there. Go ahead and pause as long as necessary for you to complete the 4 graphs, and then when you're ready, move on. Alright, so here are the answers to the 4 graphs. So we can see what's happened to the different cube roots and square root functions and what that looks like as far as the domain and range is concerned. This will conclude part 1, so when you're ready, move on to part 2.